Good morning. It is not easy for me, as an artist who lived a civil war, to talk about a neighboring civil war with unprecedented magnitude. It is uncomfortable for me also, as a descendant from my mother's side, of a genocide and deportation imposed on Greek Christian Orthodox community under the Ottoman Empire during, before, and after the World War, with haunting memories I thought buried forever. Not surprisingly though, comics authors have always addressed civil war, displacement, and genocide issues. Most of us know Art Spiegelman's graphic novel, Mouse, where the author interviewed his father about his experiences as a Polish Jew and Holocaust survivor. Many of us also are familiar with the work of Joe Sacco, the other American comics artist and narrator who went to front lines of disturbed areas of conflicts, such as the Balkans, and his related publications, Gorazde, The Fixer, and The Journalist. But Joe Sacco is mostly known in our region for his epic entitled Palestine, digging into the roots of wars, displacement, occupation, colonization that the Palestinian people endure, setting the standard of what we call nowadays BD Reportage. He was a pioneer in approaching issues related to our region, where it took others 2 decades to follow his footsteps and disclose stories about global nations in our modern history. In the last few years, a new wave of graphic novels related to the above issues emerged in the comics market. Maybe the Syrian ongoing tragedy was the trigger behind such awakening. It could be also a pure coincidence that in Europe, and since 2014, a major focus on the centennial commemoration of the First World War took place. Funds were spent into publications and comic books especially related to that era, where some of the most dramatic and violent events reshaped our region. Publishers unleashed, without knowing, demons from the past through the voices and the perspectives of those who suffered the consequences. It could also be related that the new BD reportage genre is gaining ground within the graphic novels audience, looking for more real stories rather than fantasy fictions, pushing the comics authors into fields they never looked at before, reporting, investigating big issues in graphical narrative forms. What these voices point at in common is the theme of remembrance. When asked about the Holocaust, Hitler answered, "Who, after all, speaks today of the annihilation of the Armenians?" 100 years later, authors, not all Armenians, revisited the remains of history in an attempt to engrave in the minds of young generations stories and graphical content so they never forget. Metz Yegren, in 2015, or The Great Crime as referred to within the Armenian diaspora, falls under this category. It might not be the first graphic novel, but definitely the one that depicted the cruelest scenes that ISIS nowadays might look tolerant in comparison to the absurdity of violence that it depicts. Highly documented, it became one of the visual references of the genocide. Le Cahier à Fleurs, 2012, another graphic novel, put the Armenian question in modern context. It tries to be less violent with a romance story in the background, defending a more conciliatory attitude towards the present, although stopping short at the idea of forgiveness. With an attempt of reconciliation, 2 graphic novels were published in the same year of 2015. Commemorating the event, Le Fantôme Arménien, an account of the visit of an Armenian activist to Turkey, accompanied by The Ghost of the Past, the reaction of the public to his exhibition portraying photos of the genocide. And Varto, the story of a young Turk country boy, Hassan, whose father asks him on his dying bed to escort 2 little Armenian kids, Varto and Mariam, to a safe place to escape the genocide. Varto was safe, but Mariam couldn't cross the river. And to save her, Hassan stayed with her on the other side and married her afterward to protect her. Years later, the descendants meet in France, but the wounds were so deep to heal. If the Armenian genocide is alive today in our memories, other tragedies are barely remembered, such as the atrocities endured by the Greek Christian Orthodox community under the Ottomans before, during, and after World War I. Solup in Ayvali, 2015, went in a quest to collect oral history related to the tragedy under which 1.5 million Greeks were forced out of their lands, and most of them died in the process of deportation. Many Turkish families were deported under the same agreement. Although most of the book narrates untold historic accounts, Solup focused rather on the present, especially after a friendship started between him and a Turkish family touring the same city. But the weight of history and remembrance is heavier than any reconciliation. Today, when we look towards Asia Minor, we wonder what the Turks are doing in our ports, Solup told his new Turkish friend, and received a quick reply, we also wonder what the Greeks are doing in our lands in Anatolia. Remembrance means also keeping the memory of the places and not only narration of the events. According to which side you are on, places change their names. Therefore, it's common that original names of places surface again in collective memories. Ayvali or Kidonies, two names of the same idea and place. In Greek, it is the quince fruit, and in Turkish, the place where the fruit grows in. The same goes between Smyrna versus Izmir. The international community is more familiar nowadays with the appellation of Kobani rather than Ain Arab. The land of Rojava, the west of Kurdistan, rather than north of Syria. The same goes for sure for cities, dozens of cities in occupied Palestine where the Jewish nomination overcome the Arabic ones. Deportation leaves behind unsolved issues. The major one is the identity crisis lived by the descendants. Les Pieds Noirs à la Mer, 2013, et Le Petit-Fils d'Algérie, 2015, are accounts of the deportation of more than 1 million of French Algerian-born families after the independence in '62. In the first graphic novel, Daniel ran away and took refuge at his grandparents who live in Marseille. In Algeria, the grandpa was a French dentist, married Louise, a native Jew, yet the grandfather is anti-Semitic, and the grandmother hates Algerians but speaks only Arabic. The cousin is going to marry a Muslim Arab. The book depicts the family account that is still anchored in the events of the past, with a mixture of racism, its contradictions, and paradox. In the second case, Joel Alessandra asks himself a legitimate question. Were his grandparents exploiters, racists, or slavers? Were they close to the OAS? They left everything overnight, ruminating forever deep and legitimate resentment against this country, its inhabitants, and of course the de Gaulle. In 2013, armed with his passport and a visa, and by the indispensable guide on the spot, Joel goes for the first time to Constantine, city of his family. He is ready to face his fears and doubts. The book traces this journey, similar to that of thousands of families, and if it clears the confusion of the past in his head, it deepened the confusion of Joel's emotions towards his family tragedy. A perfect sample of autobiographical work of constructed identity is Michel Stanjowski's graphic novel Toutes les Mères. The book is divided into chapters collecting her ancestors' backgrounds through her mother's memoirs. The evacuation on Greek boats of her Italian grandmother, Maria Caftaro, with her single child, Emilia, among 250,000 people during the infamous Smyrna Grand Fire of 1922. From Piraeus in Greece, she meets her Italian second husband. They move to Beirut. In Beirut, Emilia meets Mikhail, the son of a Russian general killed in the Civil War, and who himself escaped with tens of thousands of people the Bolshevik persecution and landed by boats in Turkish Gallipoli, and from there moved to Beirut. Emilia and Mikhail meet in Beirut, where Vera, her mother, is born. Michel's father, originally from Istanbul, but from Polish origins, Stanjowski, ended up in Beirut, where he fell in love with Vera, and ta-da, here comes Michel. Trust me, don't worry, it took me several readings so I can grasp the family tree of Michel Stanjowski. Michel embraced the complexity of her ethnic and cultural backgrounds, like any third generation of migrants who ended up in Lebanon. Speaking about identity, if Lebanese identity is defined by a multicultural, ethnic, and religious backgrounds, Michel is more attached to her constructed identity than others, embracing her native country and refusing to leave it despite the horrors of the civil war. The search for identity backgrounds becomes more difficult when faced with the silence of the elderly who lived the event and moved on. Si je t'oublie Alexandrie, sorry. Si je t'oublie Alexandrie 2018 reopens the case of thousands of Egyptian European communities who were forced to leave Egypt under the rise of the Arabic nationalist ideology in the 50s, and in this case, the Egyptian Jewish community after the 1948 Israeli-Arab War. Fully integrated in his French environment, Jeremy Dress tries to investigate the whole history behind his grandparents' immigration, a journey that took him from Alexandria to Tel Aviv and back to Paris to end up with a heavy weight of remorse that his grandfather, an old communist activist, dissipates with the closing sentence, "Who cares, after all? This is a very, very old history." Le Silence de Lounès, 2013, retraced the reverse path of the identity quest. Noureddin couldn't deal with his father's silence regarding the motives of his immigration to France after the independence of Algeria, thinking that his father was a pied noir and therefore a traitor. He goes back to Algeria to join the Islamic extremists. At the end of his journey, Noureddin discovers that his father was a prominent free fighter, a kind of a national hero who fled to France to escape the persecution against the Kabyle, Berber population by the new Arab leaders in power. It is the reverse path, negating the newly acquired identity to reclaim the original one and the deception that comes afterward. Ironically, the past meets with the present too in our region. Instead of digging into history of the region, some authors went to report about actual tragedies. Kobani Calling in 2016 is the most influential graphic novel from the front line. Zero Kalkari, the artist, took the road from Mosul in Iraq to Erbil, Kurdistan, to the Turkish-Syria borders, and finally to reach the Kurdish Rojava region. He reported for months to the account of the Italian newspaper Liberazione, with sarcasm, black humor, but also sadness and bitterness about the heroic fight and resistance by Kurdish women fighters facing alone ISIS in its highest moment of glory in Kobani. During the course of the narrative, Zero Kalkari depicts tragic stories of persecution and deportation of the Kurdish population throughout our modern history. Speaking of reporting, what makes comics unique as a genre is that it can represent visually the essence of situation that a documentary or a photograph or an essay can do. Our heart is there. From this roof, we took over the whole Kobani meter by meter. And what strength must this woman have to bear the weight of the wreckage of all this humanity? Or what the wise man of the village always repeats, rightfully, to the author. This is Derek Mertai's symmetry. What you find here is worth more than 1,000 essays on geopolitics. Two remarkable graphic works stand out by choosing to go personal and intimate. Instead of collecting stories about immigration, the Tunisian collective Lab 619 chose a more artistic and personal approach, what gave each artist the freedom of expressing himself or herself. Al-Hijra is one of the most powerful poetic and personal narration. of the theme with powerful visual representation. In parallel, Amour Minuscule tells a love story between an Argentinian young girl, Iris, and a Syrian university student, Ismail. He has to leave to Syria where the communication is lost. During this forced separation, Iris discovers that she's pregnant while Ismail is fighting to return home. Once reunited, the difficulty for Ismail to overcome his trauma leaves the relationship open to an unknown ending. It's really a displaced region. From the mountains of Sinjar in Iraq to the forgotten lands of South of Sudan, graphic novels were the only medium where artists visually recreated untold accounts of persecution, deportation, atrocities committed by terrorist groups or governmental militias. A true displaced region. From refugee camps in Syria, Turkey, Lebanon, the unwelcomed immigrants' camps in Europe, artists volunteered to go, witness, defend, and collect stories of people with names, coming from villages and cities that have names, running away from torturers who have names, awaiting for an unknown future. Artists from Syria, Lebanon, Tunisia, Algeria, France, Great Britain, United States, Italy, Germany, and all over the world, narrating the stories of thousands of people coming out of history books, from the streets of Damascus, down the Iraqi mountains, or crossing the Libyan desert to perish in the Mediterranean Sea, or to be stopped at the border of civilization. Through these artists, names like Modaya Mam, Salima, Haytham, Nuruddin, Zenubia, and thousands, won't be forgotten. Thank you.